I'm starting to think that this is a major contributing factor to people deconstructing, is because they think they're leaving the faith, but they've never really known what the Bible was about in the first place, because they've been discipled under topical preaching. Topical sermons are the number one way that pastors are preaching now. Topical sermons. Everywhere I go is topical sermons. And even when you go on the sermon pages and it looks like they're doing a study through a book of the Bible, they're still topical. They aren't reading a lot of the verses in context. Rather, the pastor will create a topical series on a book of the Bible and still treat it topically. And it's so interesting to me, because that is just how they go. Now, I have subscribed to a sermon farm. I despise sermon farms. I don't use sermon farms. And this is a service that churches can purchase sermons from. And none of my live streams, none of my teachings have I purchased from a sermon farm. I do all my own research and I write all my own teachings, and so does Monique. We don't have sermon farms that write our blog posts. We don't do that as a Center for Biblical Unity. And I think that the dominant model, though, that comes from these sermon farms, at least the one that I have subscribed to, is, again, topical sermons. And last week, we sat through a sermon at a church back east, and it had a second major issue that I'm seeing coming up, which is every sermon leads to a justice conversation. It's really interesting. So this guy he started out in Matthew chapter 1 in the genealogy. And I thought, great. I love the genealogies. I think genealogies are so important. You cannot literally understand the Bible if you don't understand the genealogies. And so I'm like, okay, this might be something. And in a few minutes, I had my family stop the live stream. I said, okay, I have a prediction of where this is going to go, just based on a couple of words this guy's used. And sure enough, it exactly played out. It was like, we started out in Matthew 1, and then we were talking about social justice. And I was like, wow, this is so interesting, because it felt like, I'll bet he's got a lot of sermons that all kind of go down this path. And it's so, what I'm noticing in these churches is that even the ones that you think are having book studies, it's still very, very topical. And it's so disheartening, because I turned off the live stream last week, and I'm just sitting there thinking yeah, okay, I get it. There's no perfect church, but my threshold is not a perfect church. That's not my threshold. My threshold is simply a church that has sound teaching. My threshold is a church who reads the scriptures publicly in context. That's a thing. There's instructions about that from the Apostle Paul. And why don't we take the time to read the whole chunk in context? Take 3 minutes at the outset of the sermon. And when I ask pastor this often, they say, well, I'm just pressed for time. Okay, but you're putting your words over the words of scripture. So in the economy of what I'm pressed for time for, you're deciding that you're going to put your words as a higher agenda item than the words of scripture. I just don't know what to do with that. And so there's a church that my husband and I used to attend. And one of the things I really appreciated about it was that every week there was about 5 to 10 minutes of the service that was devoted to the public reading of the scriptures. They would read an Old Testament passage, and a New Testament passage. And the two passages would be connected so that we as a congregation got discipled into promise fulfillment, history of salvation. Here's what's happening in the Old Testament. Here's what's happening in the New Testament. So if the pastor was primarily preaching on the New Testament passage, he would do it with an eye toward a relevant passage in the Old Testament. So we were knowing like, oh, these two things are linked. If he was primarily preaching in the Old Testament, he brought in some insights from the New Testament, and we were discipled to understand these big picture connections. But that's almost never done. But I think that I just finished teaching a class called God's Big Story, and every single student in the class said they had never been instructed on how to view the Bible, both Old and New Testaments, as one big story. They had been so discipled by topical sermons, they didn't know any other way about how to interpret the Bible. And that's what I really wish there was more conversation about. And I wish that more pastors would be willing to talk about, and parents also, is what are the long-term impacts of sitting under this kind of teaching, to have week after week, month after month, year after year of topical sermons. What does that approach teach the congregation to think about God and who he is? That's not to say that topical sermons are evil or you can't do them in context or biblically faithful way, but it's so rare and it's so hard to do. Theoretically possible, yes. In actuality, rare, okay? Again, there are exceptions, but the vast majority of the sermons as we've been exploring churches, it's topical sermon after topical sermon taken out of context, one or two verses that the pastor lands on, really uses as a launching point to get to the point that he wants to get to. And most of the conversation is about people's felt needs, becoming a better person, becoming a nicer person. And it's like, okay, but step back for a minute and contemplate, what is the long-term impact of these kinds of sermons? And what kind of modeling are we doing for people when this is their steady diet of the types of teachings that they get? When you have this more topical approach, and that's the dominant way that people are digesting the scripture, I think what ends up happening is that people ignore the boring parts of the Bible, the genealogies, which literally you cannot understand the Bible if you don't understand the genealogies. You end up preaching oftentimes kind of lowest common denominator themes of love or justice without wrestling through all the details, because details don't preach well. And I am starting to believe that this long-term approach to topical preaching that people have been sitting through, like my kids growing up under that, I'm starting to seriously wonder, this would make a great topic for a doctoral dissertation if you could figure out a way to measure it, is I'm starting to think that this is a major contributing factor to people deconstructing, is because they think they're leaving the faith, but they've never really known what the Bible was about in the first place, because they've been discipled under topical preaching. And they just know all of these bits and pieces here and there. And I see this day after day. The more I do these online classes, the more I am convinced that topical preaching is the long-term effects of that is fairly damaging to people's faith.